Okay. Hi, everybody. Kimberly here to deliver the week 9 lecture on critical thinking. And Rachel's here to moderate the chat. Bree is back up and Trixie is way in the background, but she's here. And it's really lovely to have you here today. This is going to be a pretty important lecture for many reasons. But the first and most important reason is at hand is because in the LPB, there's a whole part on critical thinking. And that's the biggest percentage of the LPB mark is the critical thinking mark. And critical thinking is a skill, right? It's a way to work your brain, as weird as that sounds, and it takes practice. So we're going to go over a lot of information today. There are a lot of slides. If I'm going too quickly, please use the chat, communicate with Rachel. I'll check in with Rachel from time to time, or feel free to interrupt too. I don't mind that if there's something pressing. But we're gonna move ahead. And sorry, I just have to, it's not changing. Oh, there we go. But before we begin, I do want to just do acknowledgement of country and respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we all live, work, create, and learn, and pay my respects to First Nations people and their elders past and present. So today, the lecture itself will be broken into 5 parts. The first will be defining what critical thinking is. It sounds like a bad thing with the word critical, but it's really not necessarily bad. Talking about evaluating evidence, looking at flaws in reasoning. Sometimes that's also called logical fallacies. Thinking about how to examine issues from different angles and what it's like when we do. And then thinking about how statistics can be used. And that's, for example, that statistics part, that there's a whole question on that in your LPB. So, today's lecture really directly addresses many of the things you'll find on there. So the first question then is, what is critical thinking and why is it so important? So when you think about the word critical can mean different things, right? Critical can mean, in medicine, it means life or death, right? Something you're in critical care. It can also mean, just in general parlance, to be critical means to be judgmental. But in this case, it really simply means to look carefully at what you're researching, reading, and writing. Doing so helps you make better choices, better decisions, come to better conclusions. It deepens your learning and understanding, very importantly. And that's what's really meant by critical, right? Is that deepening, it's depth. It's thinking with more depth. And then in doing so with the depth, your worldview gets broadened, which is, I think, my own bias is that's kind of cool. It is by definition an ability to actively engage with information and ideas rather than passively accept everything presented. And I argue this all the time with my students, where I say I think that social media, and I'm not against social media, but I do think that it's a passiveness, right? It's a scrolling and we just sort of like. It doesn't encourage critical thinking at all. So critical thinking is kind of like an onion and you're going to be peeling the layers. So you're looking at something, you're studying it, you're thinking hard about it, and you're looking at from different layers, different angles, and one layer may lead to another layer. So it's an appreciation that all knowledge, if this is the beginning point of critical thinking, is to appreciate that all knowledge, all information, information might be the better word there actually, is presented from a particular viewpoint, from a particular bias or a particular stance. And including, my acknowledging my own biases as I'm presenting this information. So what is critical thinking? It's more about what is the activity, right? What does it mean to think critically? Our study guide on page 218 answers this question word for word. It says, quote, in a learning context, the word critical implies a methodological or discerning approach to engaging with information and ideas. Every time you evaluate the credibility of information or take note of the way an argument is mounted, you are using your critical thinking skills. And this is incredibly important for university students. This is a skill that you want to be developing throughout your entire academic career. Any questions so far, Rachel?
Sorry, no, all good. Thanks, Kimberly.
Okay, yep. So critical thinking is a collection of specific thinking processes, and you'll notice here, it's analyzing, it's finding patterns in information, it's being able to read between the lines, right? And as a poet, that interests me very much. Lots of times meaning is in what's not said or what's just implied or suggested, right? That's how poetry works. But that's how language works in general. We just don't always think of it that way. It's making links between theory and practice, and it's weighing evidence. And not just assuming even that it's correct, but analyzing evidence itself. And then it's checking for bias or misleading information. You'll notice that there's just, I bolded, there's so much reliance here on verbs. Dissecting, breaking down, eliminating, focusing, recognizing. And then back on this one, analyzing, finding, reading, making, weighing, checking. It's active. It's a lot of doing. And so sometimes it's tiring. It's exhausting. After a lot of research plus critical thinking, your brain could feel really tired. I think that's a pretty good thing. So critical thinking is very close to analytical thinking. You might even be able to swap terms a little bit, right? Analytical thinking is describing a thinking style that enables a person to break down complex information or a series of comprehensive data. And it uses a step-by-step method to analyze problems and come to a solution. So we're going to look at later in the lecture some type of thinking with the 6 hats approach. And that's one method, right? So analytical thinking is doing analysis, and that involves critical thinking. So sometimes you'll hear the terms used a little bit interchangeably. And again, we already glanced at this slide, right? It's dissecting information, breaking down complex ideas, eliminating irrelevant data, focusing on facts and evidence, and recognizing an author's purpose or bias, and not just an author, but a speaker, or if an advertisement, right? The source, recognizing the bias of a source and how they're positioning you. Ultimately, what does the author or the source want from the user or the reader? So to do this effectively, you want to be able to step back from given information. So when you're given information, when you read an advertisement, when you're on social media and you see a certain post, when you're doing your research, when you're on a website, right? You need to be able to step back from that information and gain a little distance from it. And then you want to look for flaws in the reasoning or the evidence of that thing. And we'll look at examples of this as the lecture goes on, so that I'm not just, this is all sort of very much in the abstract, but I promise that we'll make it more concrete with examples in just a bit. You want to make sure you're looking at the information from many different angles, right? And so generally speaking, we tend to only look at information or sources from our own selves point of view, but there are ways to step out of that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And we'll even use my mother as an example, which just, sorry, just a little tantalizing thing there. um, you need to be aware of your own preconceptions, and that can be the hardest thing, right? Just stepping outside of ourselves. You want to constantly, this comes from the University of Canberra, which is where I was before coming to CQU. You want to be constantly asking questions about what you see, hear, evaluating, categorizing, and finding relationships. That's also something else, making connections. That's very important. So there's all kinds of, and I'm sure at this point, it is not at all news to say to anybody that there's a lot of misinformation in the world. And that's why this critical thinking is so important, to be able to discern what is accurate and what isn't. There's also disinformation. So just a little bit of difference in the prefix. Misinformation is false information that people believe to be true. And disinformation is false information that's been deliberately spread to cause confusion and undermine trust and authority. So misinformation can be just when somebody has a misconception and is sharing that and other people are buying into it. But it's not necessarily, it has a lot to do with intention, right? It's not necessarily on purpose. Whereas disinformation might be, during the Trump campaign back in for the 2016 election, they have proof now that there was a lot of fake news generated to sway public opinion to get voting in a certain direction. That's disinformation, right? That information that was used deliberately to cause confusion and undermine trust. And you'll notice this mis or disinformation coming up in fake news, as I've already mentioned, but it can be through the manipulation of images. It can be through misleading info shared on social media. It can be through scam advertisements. It can even be through like scam websites or, something that looks legitimate, but is not. So here's an obvious way that misinformation gets spread, and that is through tabloids. I tried to include one from each different country. And there's a phrase in the US that comes from the Inquirer, right? Inside Tom's House of Horrors. Their ad for many, many years was to get you to buy their tabloid was inquiring minds want to know. And quite often is a joke. Americans will say that to each other when you ask a question. Fake news can include misleading content, false context. So changing, the context that information's coming from. It can be manipulated content. It can be fabricated. It can be imposter. There's so many ways that that you have to sort of have your wits about you. And it's probably, I'm going to guess, that only getting worse as AI can now create images and, things can look very, very real that aren't. And just a note too, that satire or parody is separate, right? If something's being satirized, and I have an example of this in a little while, it's not false, right? It has so much to do about intention, and the intention of parody or satire is actually to call attention to the flaws in a humorous way, but then bring what's wrong into a general, to get the general public thinking about it, right? That's what satire does in a movie, let's say. Any questions? How are we going, Rachel? Any comments?
lots of little bits of chat, but no direct questions
Okay.
as yet about the critical thinking. Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll just go forward. So here's an example. I've already mentioned it, of how things can be manipulated. And this wasn't even for the election of 2016, but this was after the election. And the image itself is very important, right? You've got the White House. This is Sean Spicer, who used to be Trump's leading PR person. And he's showing an image on the right of Trump's inauguration. You can see in that image Trump walking down this blue carpet and going to be inaugurated as president. And this is a very striking visual of all these people there, right? And this was on national television, right? It was in January of 2017. It was shown this way. This is how his inauguration was. If you look at this photo on the one on the left, it is actually the inauguration itself, and you can see how many fewer people are there than this image depicts. And it can just be all about angles. It can be about photoshopping. I mean, there's just so many different ways to do it. And just as comparison, the image on the right with the very full, this is the area of the Capitol. It's a public area. And that's the Obama inauguration on the right. So you can see how the Trump's not organization, administration, that's the word I want, might have been feeling a little sheepish about the lack of turnout. And so they just made it look better than it was. And it might seem rather harmless, but you need to really think, well, how does this kind of a perception affect the world? It's important to think about because it does have some overall effect, right? I think that in the rest of the world, people think that Trump is much more popular in the US than he is. Not to say he doesn't have an absolute mass of supporters, he does, but he also has many more people who are not in favor of his politics. Here is just an absolutely brilliant parody. This is Melissa McCarthy, that you might know her from different comedy movies. The Bridesmaids movie is hilarious. And this is her playing Sean Spicer. So she's taking this moment and she's satirizing it. And you can even see the image on the left of her watching herself be Sean Spicer. And it's pretty funny. So, the whole point of satire then being to call attention to the things that are maybe not going well in our society or societies. And it kind of pointing it out through humor. So that's what she's doing here. So, one question to ask ourselves if we're thinking critically is, why are we as human beings so susceptible to fake news? Why do we have to be on guard for it all the time? So I did a bit of research, and there's an expert, Dr. Greg Nalesi at the University of Melbourne, has a really interesting article about this. He's an expert in media and fake news. And here are some quotes that I took right out of his article, right? Human beings are generally bad at detecting fake information because it looks real and we think we recognize a pattern. So if you go back to that slide that I showed about what critical thinking is, we use patterns, right, to establish it. A lot of times we're looking at patterns, and when patterns are broken, then this is a bit of an alarm. It's something to look at. But if something's following the pattern, then we just give into it. Also, with online information, when we share information, we don't give it much scrutiny. Human beings are, research finds that humans are more inclined to share bad news than good news. And then fear, the emotion of fear, plays a big part of this. And then I love the last one. It's pretty interesting. Is there somebody who needs to be on mute? Humans have a tendency to downplay factual information that is threatening. So the last 3 points about fear all work together. And this is actually comes out of anthropological research that shows that misinformation thrives when people have little control over their environmental threats. So things that still affect us, for all the technology we have in the world, we're still very vulnerable to, earthquakes and fires and volcanic eruptions and all the things that frighten us. And so because of this, and the last 3 points here also explain the popularity of conspiracy theories, which we will talk about in just a moment. So propaganda is one way that misinformation is spread, right? And in very extreme forms, we might think of propaganda as something that is, only propagated by extremists, right? So, the Nazis were very well known for their propaganda campaigns, getting people on board with their very extreme views. And then, sort of the legacy, right? If you think about organizations that are less tolerant, white supremacist organizations, for example, right? This is what they use. And it is in certain ways a type of fake news, right? It's extremity. But it's also used then. Here's an example of a dogfight that was posted by the Ukrainian defense. But it actually is an image that they just took from a video game. So, they've put this as a way to show that the war is not going the Russians' way. And it's coming from video games. So I would just like to know, because I think this is actually really important, in Spanish, if you're talking about advertising, like, did you see the ad on TV? You would use the word propaganda. That's the word they use for the word ad. I think that's always struck me as something very interesting. Almost all advertisement to some degree, because it wants to spin something a certain way so that you buy into the product or you buy into the situation. Is the type of propaganda, if you think about it. So it just becomes really, really important that we fact check. And there are all kinds of fact checking sites that you can find. There are Australian ones, RMIT, the uni down in Victoria has one. The Conversation, which is that it's the online periodical, the online journal that is part journalism and part scholarly, and you've read a couple of articles from The Conversation if you're taking the EWU class. And there's international fact-checking sites. My favorite one happens to be Snopes. That's the one that is listed first. There's also factcheck.org and climate feedback. Here's an example. I went to Snopes because I do really love it. If I hear something online on social media, in the media, the news media, and I'm dubious, I will go immediately to Snopes because it is so good. So you use it. It's got a database, and you put in the topic that you're writing, that you're wanting to check. So this was a cover of Vogue magazine after the Olympics, where the Algerian gold medalist was put on the front. And, in the Middle East, this would be a big thing to have a woman boxer on the front of Vogue, but it's completely fake. Vogue, Snopes does their research and they come up with the fact that this has been generated by AI software. It could be traced to a digital creator on Instagram. And because this is Vogue itself does not have an issue or a magazine that comes out in Algeria. And so nothing about this is accurate. So these sites really do help us get to the bottom of things. Conspiracy theories are another way that fake news or misinformation. It could even qualify in some cases, I guess, as disinformation, just sort of depending on intent. But there, you know, it comes from a similar source as fake news comes from. And to have a conspiracy theory, the definition is to have at least two people believe in the theory. So in order for it to be a conspiracy theory, there has to be more than one person buying in. And they can really have, conspiracy theories can have great impact because it can affect, you know, the way governments work. It can affect decisions that are made for people, for countries. Science, it can affect, you know, science. And, you know, it's generally known that, sorry, I don't have the slide nearby, but it's, you know, it's generally known that here's an example on the slide of COVID-19, right, is a hoax. 5G is the killer. And so when you get ideas out there in the world, and because we have this way of sharing information now so instantly and so globally, then it's hard. It's an uphill struggle to figure out the truth, let alone then make decisions based on it. So that's why all of this is so important. You know, just doing a little bit of critical thinking. So anything so far, Rachel?
Lots of interesting chats, you know, just going on about the
That's great.
conspiracy theories and things, and
Good.
yeah, no questions yet, but yeah, just chat,
Oh
agreeing
no,
with various
that's
aspects of yeah,
yeah, that's
the
great.
way
Thank you.
conspiracy theories work and the kind of things that get spread. So yeah, cool,
When I
thanks.
Yeah, when I was at University of Canberra teaching there, one of the assignments students had is they had to do an oral presentation on conspiracy theories, and what they had to do was present the theory, and then they had to argue their most what they felt was the most likely version, you know, because lots of times there are different versions, and it was a really difficult um assignment for them, but oh, they were so fascinating and fun. And so I did I took the whole, there are theories, conspiracy theories that come from Harold Holt's disappearance, the former prime minister who was lost. And I did a model of the presentation. I went off, I did all my research, and then I put together what was the most viable theory, and I argued for it. And it was just a really great exercise in figuring out how information can be misshared so prevalently. I wanted to just take a moment as we're talking about advertising, propaganda, critical thinking, to show the way that language, not only images can be used, like the Vogue one we just saw, but language is used this way all the time, so prevalently that probably most of the time we don't even notice it. And so thinking critically means just taking a moment and noticing why is it phrased that way, or what is phrasing something that way do to my understanding of this information. Neil Postman was an author and educator, and he was most importantly a cultural and media critic and theorist. He died in 2003, so he's been gone a couple decades now, but his work hasn't changed much. He had this list of what he called weasel words. And the way that they're used, you know, 20 plus years after his passing hasn't changed at all. And we just hear this so much, or we see this so much in advertising, right? So certain words like help, improved, more, the word sale, the word virtually is such a weasel word because it doesn't really mean much. Um, and if you think about the way it's used in advertising now, 50% more than before. Like you would see that on a product that you would get at Woolies, right? Or Kohl's. And you don't even think like more what? More quantity, more, it probably could be more cost, but they're not completing the comparison. And so they're sort of implying something, and creating a certain effect with the product that may or may not actually be true, or it's just an empty claim is really what it is. It's not supported or backed up. Here's an example. It will give you all something to do for a minute. I'm going to read this ad, and then I'd like you all to put in chat where you see the weasel words. So this is for the Lancome product, Dream Tone Ultimate Dark Spot Corrector. And the ad says that Dream Tone is the next generation in dark spot correcting. This customized skin tone correcting serum is so powerful, 72% of women dare to bare their skin. The new Dream Tone is 3 barely tinted serums formulated to visibly correct dark spots, color imperfections, and give you a more even-looking skin tone. It comes in 3 serums customized for your skin tone. For best results, apply the product twice a day, morning and evening, under your moisturizer. So where are you seeing the weasel words here? Where's the language slippery? Rachel, what have you got? Have you got anything?
Nothing just yet on the chat. I'll give them a chance to.
Yep,
Yep.
absolutely.
We've got more even looking, correcting,
Yes.
correct, customized,
More even looking than what?
powerful.
Right? The suggestion is before. Yes, powerful. I mean, it's a lot of it is very empty language. Formulated to visibly correct dark spots. What does it mean to correct a dark spot? It doesn't say fade. It doesn't say make invisible. It says correct. It almost makes it sound like an essay. So it sounds really good, but when you start really thinking about how is this language used,
And then there's a comment about the 72%. So where do they actually get their statistics from?
I've got this slide later in the presentation when we
Hold that
talk
thought.
about, yes, no, that's perfect. That person
Cool.
is anticipating right where we're going. So good on you. So what this means is that we need to evaluate evidence. We need to evaluate what's in front of us. And to some degree, the RAOC framework that you've maybe run into in EWU, right? And I'll gloss the RAOC in a minute. But it's giving us an opportunity, a method for doing this critical thinking, for really looking at information in front of us and helping us decide, is this authentic? Is it accurate? Is it current, right? Sometimes it's not that information is wrong. It's just maybe that it's old. I mean, once upon a time, everybody thought the earth was flat, right? It was just generally agreed upon. So with more information as time passes, right? Even looking at currency, looking at authority, looking at objectivity, and looking at relevance, right? That's what the RAOC stands for. And I know that was completely out of order. It's just the way my nonlinear brain thinks. Sorry about that. So can you see that when you glance at the slide, can you see sometimes there are 4 and sometimes there are 3? You all see that? And sometimes that's just how information is, right? Perception is all, ultimately. Truth is determined by perspective. And sometimes, actually, things are so complex that multiple things that appear to be contradictory can be true all at the same time. But I don't think we very often stop to allow for that kind of complexity. So here is an example, right? This is the royal family. My guess is most of you will recognize the majority of people in this photo. The British monarchy, and this is different ways that they are understood in the world, right? Some people see them as important leaders and role models. Other people see them as capitalists who built wealth from stealing land and resources. Much more critical view. Some people see them as just expensive and no longer necessary. Some people think they're entertaining and lucrative, right? They earn the media so much money, you know, that they often are used in these tabloids that I showed earlier, right? Because people will buy magazines when the royals are on the cover. And sometimes they're seen as people who expect you to bow to them, right? And these are different views, right? One of these five is the point of view of indigenous peoples, possibly. I'm not speaking for them, but I'm guessing. Also monarchists, this is one of their likely views. Again, not speaking for them. Media outlets, I sort of gave that one away. Republicans see them in a certain way. And my mom, this is where my mom is, right? One of these points of view is my mother's point of view, as an elderly American. So I leave you to figure out which is which and I'll just leave this up for a moment. So you can do it like a matching quiz. And then we'll look at the answer here in a second. In the meantime, anything going on, Rachel, that need to be aware of?
No questions, lots of chat.
Okay.
Comments about the
Super.
picture.
Okay, well
The
then
picture on the
let's
whole family and all sorts, yeah, but yeah.
let's so monarchists very likely see themselves as important leaders and role models, right? People who support monarchy, and this doesn't even have to be just the British monarchy. There are plenty of monarchies left in the world. Indigenous peoples maybe have a different view that these are capitalists who built wealth from stealing land and resources, right? And if you think of the era of colonization and the effect that it had, it was just resulting in massive, massive losses. Republicans will be the ones likely to think they're just expensive and unnecessary. We've got forms, we've got parliament now, we've got other forms of governing. What do we need the king and queen and the royal family for? Of course, the media outlets do see them as entertaining and lucrative, because as I've already said, it sells. The royals sell, even in the US, right? Now that Harry and Meghan have moved to North America, right? There's cash to be made there as well through media outlets. And my mother sees them as those people who expect you to bow down to them. And I think it's just such an incredibly funny, when she says that, it makes me laugh so hard, because I don't know why she has that perspective. I wouldn't think she would have such a just this average woman from Detroit, Michigan, but this is how she sees them. And so, these are just five examples of perspectives and perceptions in the world of this one thing, this one entity, right? And they all exist simultaneously. And probably from each person's point of view, certainly my mother's, right? They're very convinced that their way of seeing it is quite accurate. And so that's just an example of how complexity can exist. And, rather than really fighting for one point of view, acknowledging that there can be many and they can all be valid to a certain degree, I think is quite important. That too is part of critical thinking, is allowing complexity, allowing there to be a width of views. Yeah, so just letting my mom rattle on. Evaluating evidence then, as so I've already said, it's influenced by perspective, is tricky because of the way that ideas can be multiply in the world. I put the picture of the dress up here because this was the dress that was absolutely famous on the internet in 2015, because some people, when they look at this, will see a gold and white dress. That's what I see. But other people will look at it and they'll see black and blue. And so it's all, and it really has to do with your eyes. And there's a scientific reason why we see this different people see this differently. There were battles on the internet. And then, not to mention that screens and technology itself can influence the way images are colored and portrayed to the eye. So the RAOC method is the one that I mentioned out of order a few minutes ago, right? It's looking at each issue, each bit of information, especially if you're going to be using it in university or academic work, and looking at how relevant is this issue to my own project, to my own what I'm studying, learning, researching. Where is this information coming from? That is absolutely crucial because there's just so much false authority in the world, people claiming to be experts. And there are no internet police in the sense that there's, if I wanted to create a whole website and dedicate that website to auto mechanics because I'm from Detroit, right? I could, but I would be one of the least qualified people in the world to do that. I'm excited that I can change a tire and pump my own fuel. That is it. That's as much as I can do with a car. So, nothing's to stop me though from creating this website that looks very convincing. So we have to be able to look at our sources with these four aspects in mind and ask, is this the best source that we could be using for our academic, for our university work? So truth changes, right, when we expand our collective knowledge. And there's the example on the right of the flat earth and the round earth illustration. And Google Scholar, if you're looking for a place to find out, to find really information where you don't have to worry quite so much about the authority of it or the objectivity of it, or you want to find the most current, going to Google Scholar instead of just going to plain Google, right? That's a great place to start, as is CQU's library or any university library using their databases. So this brings us to part 3, which is the logical fallacies. And anything going on out there that sort of barreling through this?
Yeah, no, that's all good. There's lots of questions about, oh, not questions, but comments about things. But yeah, discussion, but no questions. So yeah,
I can see there are 94 chats, so things are happening out there. So thank you so much. So when we're looking for flaws in reasoning, we want to be thinking about how arguments are crafted. Logical fallacies historically are at the heart of essay writing, are at the heart of academic writing, right? Where you want to be able to make claims and draw conclusions without oversimplifying, without playing on emotions, without overgeneralizing. That's one of the other ones. Here's an example of a logical fallacy, right? And this is a quote: either vaccines aren't as good as claimed, or the real goal of pandemic safety measures is to control the public, not the virus. And that comes from an anti-vax group. That quote does from the media. And the problem with this statement, if you're just going to boil it down, is that it's an either or fallacy, because they're only given two options. They're only giving two options. Either they aren't as good as they claimed, that may not be true, or they're trying to control the public. And there's so many other possibilities, right? It would be like if you said about the royal monarchy, right? Either they're good role models or they're people we spend too much money on. And you didn't allow for any of the other options, and we didn't even cover them all. So that's an example of a flaw in thinking, where you're reducing it too much and you're only saying this or that. And you see these in the world a lot, for example, with this anti-vax group. There are other types of flaws in reasoning. But here's just I really liked this either or. A lot of times I liked this cartoon here, right? Where we do this at the personal level. We think this way. We only give ourselves two options, right? I'm going to go to the party or I'm going to be bored at home all night, right? When in fact, you could be at home with a friend, not at all bored, having fun. Or, you know, you could go to the party just for an hour. Or, you know, or you could go out, but not to the party and go to a nice dinner. There's just so many options, but we don't always allow ourselves to think about all the options. We reduce it. We limit our own choices. We do this at a personal level. We're very likely to do this then at bigger levels, like when we're considering evidence. So you just have to be careful. Here's another type. This is an example of another type of logical fallacy. This would be where you have false authority, where you take, and advertising absolutely relies on this. I love this example because this is Shaquille O'Neal in Australia, right? This is him making all of these ads for gambling, a gambling app. And he's come all the way across the world to do this. And I love this. You can find these videos on YouTube, which is where I got these screenshots from. But I love these taglines: faster, easier, better. So you've got, these are comparison words, right? But it doesn't at any point say faster, easier, or better than what. And it actually doesn't even say what is. It's just assumed, you know, they're talking about the app. But there's absolutely no point of comparison here truly made. And then they're also PointsBet built different. And the question, if you're thinking critically, when you see this advertisement, should be built different than what? Or why is it important to be different in this subject or in this topic? And why is it important for an app to be different? There are all these suggestions here. By not saying a whole lot and choosing just key words and key phrasing, they can try to say a lot when they're really saying very, very little. It's just thinking critically can make you aware of this. So yeah, this is an example of false authority because this man played really good basketball a couple of decades ago. He's in no way qualified to talk about technology, as far as I know, but we just give over to it. And that's how advertising works. Another type of fallacy is attack on a person. It's called the ad hominem. That's the official Latin name for the fallacy. And so and we do this so much, we don't even stop to acknowledge that we're doing it. And I include myself in that too, right? When somebody, especially in politics, has a point of view, a perspective, a campaign, and it goes against our own beliefs or our own points of view, we oftentimes dismiss the idea by dismissing the person, right? So Scott Morrison opposing a $1 wage hike, right? Rather than taking on and looking at the economics of this idea and the impact that a $1 wage hike would have on the Australian economy, you just dismiss, you call him ScoMo and you just get rid of it, right? Because he's not a likable person. This has got to be a bad idea. And we do this, because of fame and because of media, we only get these snippets of people. We don't really know them, but we think we know them. And then we critique ideas based on who we think they are as a person. That's a very flawed way of thinking, but it's very, very common. Another way that we think poorly is with the slippery slope argument. So when we're trying to explain cause and effect, That really is what slippery slope is that you take a cause and effect relationship and you sort of mash it together. So an example of this would be if we claim that moving away from fossil fuels will have a catastrophic effect on the economy, but we don't back this with evidence or information, right? There's an opposite one, right? Where if we're not investing in renewable energy resources, there'll be a catastrophic effect on the environment. This also is a slippery slope argument. Slippery slope arguments are so prevalent. Oftentimes we use them to debate ethics and morality issues, so this idea that maybe doing a minor drug like marijuana, people will claim, well, that will make you into a drug addict, right? That's a slippery slope argument where we just take the beginning instance and we catastrophize it. And you can't really tell where it's gone wrong, but it has. So you have to be very careful with these. Media loves slippery slope arguments because it's attractive and it's making catastrophic. That's the only way I can say that word. Is appealing for viewers, right? People will watch as it seems like there's a catastrophe at hand. Overgeneralizing is another prevalent way of thinking fallaciously. And here's an example when Scott Morrison said in 2020, firefighters, quote, want to be out there defending their communities, right? It's taking these, if there's a single firefighter who was hesitant about having to do this, which would be 100% completely understandable, right? What he'd be saying would be wrong. So you have to be very careful with overgeneralizations. I read a student paper last semester that claimed that everyone has access to the internet nowadays. And it's easy to make a claim like that. But out of the 8 billion people we have in the world right now, 66% of the world population has access to the internet. And right now, there are just under 3 billion people. That's a heck of a lot of people who don't, right? So while this has a truth to it that the majority, if you say everyone, right, that choice of word is disqualifying. It's overgeneralizing, and thus the statement is no longer true. If this is in a paper and it's the foundation for a point, and it's going to be making a point, right? The point is moot because the thought process doesn't line up. It's an overgeneralization. There's a logical fallacy. Anybody who's a critical thinker is going to likely dismiss this information. Hasty generalizations, unfortunately, also give us stereotyping, right? So anytime we're going to throw a group of people all under the same judgment, we've made a gross or sweeping generalization. You get one millennial out there in the world, and I know many, many, many who work their butts off, which they do, then the statement is not true. And that's what stereotypes are based on, right? All of this is relying on people not thinking critically. And you think about, like, there was that phase a few years ago where the boomers were taken to task, right? I don't know why we do this with our generations. We just don't allow people to be people. So I know we're running pretty short on time, but the last two parts of this are a little bit shorter. How are we going, Rachel?
Yep, no questions. Just discussion about the various bits of content, but yeah,
okay.
All good.
So the question that comes then is, how can we examine issues from different angles? And all the way back at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned methods, right? That critical thinking, it's methodical. Here is one method that I love because it's not only a type of analytical thinking, but it's also there's a lot of creativity in it as well. And so that would be the whole brain, right? You'd be using your whole brain if you're adopting a method like this. Edward de Bono was a man who just passed away in 2021, and he had this idea of the 6 thinking hats. And Edward de Bono in our family is my mom's best friend, worked with him for years and trained under him, and so he's very dear to our family. But what happens is that a way of thinking like 6 hats means that you can have parallel thinking. You can have contrary views all at the same time when you're thinking about a certain topic or an idea. And then the parallel thinking encourages lateral thinking, which is when you're solving problems by making connections rather than strictly going forward. You might draw on a prior piece of knowledge. If you think about lateral passes in footy or any kind of football, right, where you go sideways to go forward, that's what lateral thinking is with the brain. So when you're looking at Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, you're taking one topic and you're looking at it from 6 different angles, right? You're putting different hats on, so to speak, in order to have, in order to allow yourself the opportunity to look at different perspectives on the same idea. And I'll have an example of this in just a minute, but very quickly, the 6 different hats, the colors relate to ways that you're thinking about your topic. So the first one is going to be the white hat, which is research, statistics, backing up arguments, using logic, being objective. So this would be very academic. This would be the very academic approach. Red hat is a bit of the opposite, right? Where you're using feelings, intuition, your gut, your passion, your personal opinions to think about a topic. Blue hat is thinking with the big picture, it's thinking globally, where you're thinking about what is the big picture and what is the context that picture provides. Green hat is where you start to think about solutions and possibilities. This is especially important if you're problem solving. Green hat will be thinking about how to go forward, what are all our alternatives, how can we be creative in our approaches, what new ideas do we have? And then the yellow hat is looking at the benefits. So you could combine, let's say, the green hat and the yellow hat, where you're thinking about the benefits and the ways to move forward. But when you're thinking about the benefits of something, you're thinking about advantages, strengths, likelihood of success, assessing value. And then the black hat is it's the devil's advocate. It's looking at weaknesses, what's wrong with a plan, where should we be using caution. And when you can get all 6 hats working together, you're much more likely to take a situation, a problem, information that you're being presented with and really look at it much more wholly than if you were only to look at a single angle. And our personalities, as we've already learned in PSU, right? Our personalities have we all have certain penchants or leanings in our makeup. And so we might be much more inclined to think with a certain hat on. And what this is allowing ourselves to do is have the exercise of taking and putting hats on we might not normally wear and looking at ideas in new ways. So the example I thought to just run by you quickly is could be very personal to each of us. If you're thinking about your own personal finances, right? How would we use the 6 thinking hats to be thinking about our financial situations individually, right? And so the white hat, if you're a white hat person, you'd be looking at your data, right? You'd be looking at your spending, your earning, what's coming in, what's going out, and then how much is being spent in certain areas, food, transportation, utilities. Sometimes nowadays we have apps that tell us this, right? by Uber Eats, and it tells me I've spent $65.30 on eating out this month. So sometimes our apps do this for us. If we're a red hat thinker, we're thinking about our personal finances and we're maybe having a lot of feelings. Maybe it's anxiety, or maybe it's relief, or maybe it's fear. And the idea is, if we could try to remember that our emotions tell us where we are in life, and give us lots of information about how we're feeling about certain situations or certain ideas, that's actually good information to have. Lots of times feelings are dismissed, right? Because they change, because they're not objective. But they can give us a lot of information if we allow them to. Thinking about finances, the blue hat is going to be active, right? So in light of finances, do make a budget. Think about prioritizing. If you only have so much money, the blue hat thinker is going to think, what do we spend first? And you're going to do all of this in writing on a monthly basis, right? The green hat thinker is going to be thinking, maybe if the white hat is telling us that the income is low, the green hat responds by saying, maybe we could sell some things. Maybe we could pick up a second income stream. Maybe we could get a housemate. The green hat is trying to find alternatives that are viable for increasing personal income. The yellow hat will be considering what are the benefits of getting finances under control, initiating controlled spending. Maybe the yellow hat thinker is thinking, okay, in all of this, we're going to be saving for a holiday or a reward. And then the black hat thinker is going to be playing devil's advocate and is going to be looking at things like, well, where is there overspending? Where is there unnecessary spending? And at the end of all this, you can see that one approach is not better or worse than the other. They're just each different. And the more hats you can put on, the more you're going to be able to find conclusions or even find a way forward that might be helpful to you. And so you think about this in terms of just personal finances, but if you think about this in terms of problems you might have at work, or the way you're thinking about working through a problem that you're having with your studies, right? You're giving yourself a lot more options. And you're also giving yourself a big picture to think about. So in short, this framework encourages parallel thinking and creative thinking. Sorry, it uses parallel thinking, encourages creative thinking. The lateral thinking I've already mentioned, lateral thinking is exciting because sometimes it will surprise us. It provides a variety of ways to approach issues. It gives thinkers greater flexibility and adaptability, which is, that is a great, those are great characteristics for both students and professional people to have in their work, right? Whether it's academic work or work, to be flexible and adaptable daily. That's very helpful. And it also gets us out of our habitual ways of thinking, which is incredibly important. I could tell you as a human being, those 6 hats, when I think about my personal finances, I always first defer to one hat. This was a great exercise putting this example together because it reminds me of all the different ways I could be thinking. You could even just be thinking in terms of gratitude and how lucky you are to have what you have. That's yet another perspective that I didn't even put on the slides. So the last part here then is about statistics and thinking about numbers and how they're used in the world because of our inherent fallback to really thinking about statistics and numbers and research. We tend to think that these are very concrete ways of looking at evidence, but this is the person earlier in today's lecture mentioned, right? There's this 72% of women dare to bare their skin. And I'm just going to close my window. Somebody else shouting. Where does this number come from? Like it's just so random in a way. And you know, so it's okay to ask when it comes to statistics. We tend to accept them very quickly, but there's so many different ways you need to be thinking about how are statistics being used. So there's an article about Australians loving coffee, and that even says we have proof. And it's written by Lee Campbell and Tom Campanoni, if I'm saying that right. And there are all these interesting statistics, right? 87% of Australians admit that they give specific instructions when ordering coffee, right? 50% of Aussies say it makes them feel angry if their coffee isn't good. 6% will say it completely ruins their day. And baristas should be aware that there are no second chances. This is what the article says, because almost 1 in 2 won't ever go back if they receive a bad cup. But you don't even have to dig a little, because it says straight away that the survey was done by Nespresso. So where is the problem with that? I'm asking you. If Nespresso makes the survey and then they make an article about it and they publish it in 2016. If we're thinking critically, what are we isolating here as problematic?
We've got in the chat here some bias. So there's bias that might be there. Linda said agenda. I think you mean like that they have an agenda.
Yeah.
Brad said organic coffee only. Is that because they're only looking at organic coffee?
I don't know.
Yeah. Not sure what you mean by that, Brad. You might need to elaborate on that one. But yeah, the bias and agenda are two that have come up.
That's right. So there is bias and agenda because Nespresso is a for-profit company, right? And they want you to buy their product. And really, I mean, I don't have an espresso machine, but my understanding is you have it in your home. And I am a coffee lover, admittedly, but I think what this does is this, you know, in some ways suggests maybe don't go out for your coffee, right? If you want to have it a certain way every day, maybe buy our product, just make it at home. And then 6% of you, you know, won't completely ruin your day. I mean, there's just massive holes in this. It doesn't matter what the statistics say. If we go back to the RAOC, there's not a lot of authority here, right? And there's not a lot of objectivity. They're going to have an agenda, as somebody said. I love that word, right? And who knows who put this together or how the study was run. So questions we could be asking if we're thinking critically then is, well, okay, in this study, how many participants were there? What questions were they asked? What was the method for conducting the survey? If you were looking at academic articles, you'll notice always one of the sections, especially if it's about research, first primary research, right? They're going to talk about methods. There's going to be a whole section for it. And a lot of times it's probably where the information is most dense, right? Hardest to understand because the experts know what they're doing. And if you're not in that field, it's hard to know. You also want to be asking, where was the survey conducted? If you're pretending to represent Australians and you're using Australia as a country, then are you sampling from people from all over the country, or was this done only in Victoria? Right? So these are the kinds of questions a critical thinker will ask. And then who did it? Who at Nespresso was in charge of this? And agenda is there's our word again. So using the RAOC, it keeps your thinking cap on, and it does really allow you to ask, is this relevant to my own purpose? How do you know that information is credible? Is there an objective intention here, or is it biased, emotional / opinionated? And how does it fit your task or focus? So Mark Twain, who I realized going through my slides earlier looks a little bit like Albert Einstein, said, there are lies, damn lies in statistics. And I love Mark Twain. He was an American writer from the 19th century, and he was so funny. He's laugh out loud satirist, speaking of satire. So it's neat that he should have a slide here. So we've already had a look at that. So we're just at our conclusion now. So thank you all so much, because I know this has gone a few minutes over, but I'll just wrap it up really fast and just give you a few reminders, and then we'll be done. So just going back to the original verbs we started with, if you're thinking critically as an advanced thinker, you need to remove yourself from the immediacy of the information that you're given. Take a step back from it, look for flaws, weigh evidence, examine the information from many angles, and then think about how all of this meets your own preconceptions, your own stance or bias. And then you need to be able to ask questions, just like the questions on the prior slide that I asked, right? Where was this study done? Who did it? Geographically, what areas were covered, right? Those questions are good because they prompt thinking. They keep you sharp. When you get to your LPB, there are going to be 2 articles that you find on Moodle, and you're going to be asked to read the article and then apply some of what we've just gone over. So if you're, remember that this is recorded. If you need to go back and catch any information, there are 2 topics here: binge drinking, Australia's binge drinking culture, and then the struggle of teachers because children are awful. So just having you have a look at one of those 2 articles and apply some of what we've just talked about to the article and this is part of the LPB so that you can show your ability. So part A about the article is going to ask you to look at the main argument and to decide if it's objective or not. It's asking you to look at their sources of evidence, how authoritative and trustworthy. And then 2 examples that you see here of red hat thinking. So this part of the LPB, this module 9, it's pulling together a lot of what we just went over today. And then it's asking in part B for you to think about statistics that are quoted in the news report and how can we be sure that they're believable. And that will be based on a lot of what I just talked about in the lecture as well. So hopefully you find it very applicable. Things you want to be doing this week in week 9 is printing out one of these 2 articles or both, or if you don't want to print, just having a read online. Though evidence shows lately that it's better if you can have things off of screens when you're reading, but that's for another day. You want to be looking at the module 9 section of the Learning Portfolio B. You want to be thinking about already editing because we're already getting to the 2nd week of September, and this is due at the end of the month. So thinking about your word limit, week 11. So you've got about 2 weeks plus this week's. And then if you haven't yet organized your oral presentation, that is something that you should be finishing. It doesn't mean you have to have done the oral presentation so much as that you need to know when you're doing it. And so if you need assistance with any of that, please get in touch with your support lecturer. And that's it. Anything, Rachel? Thank you so much for those of you who stayed a little bit late.
Yeah, just some comments about different types of industries and how they promoted certain things like, or different industries paying for research to be done to prove a certain point.
Yes.
Just that whole issue of needing to be really aware of how bias can creep in. And just on that note, I remember going to a conference once and hearing a researcher, and her sole thing was to research how bias operates in the research process. And it's not just even in how the results are reported, but it's, you know, how the whole research process is constructed and the kind of things you were saying, the questions that are asked, who they ask, when they ask them, who they don't ask, you know, all of these things are actually part of the research process and can create the results that are needed to prove a point. So it gets tricky. You need to be really discerning and be able to pick through all of these things to pick
discern
out.
Discern is a great word, and I really do love that example. I mean, I don't know about the rest of the world, but I do know in the US, you know, you have to be very careful with pharmaceutical companies and the research, right? Because their research sometimes is designed to back their product to make it very necessary in the world of medicine, so people use it. And that's just one example. I don't know if that came up in the chat or not.
Oh, not yet, but I'm sure it would.
I was just going to, Rachel, you've just reminded me, this is a very, you'll have to forgive me, everyone, for my very nerdy linguistic point, but you saying that, Rachel, about asking questions. When I did my linguistics degree, I remember there was this concept like, don't ask about the moon. And it was about when you're interviewing, like when police and things interview people after a crime, they have this rule not to ask about the moon because like sometimes there isn't a moon visible. So, but you prompting and saying, well, what was the moon? Was it a full moon? Was it a, you know, a quarter moon? Can put a moon in someone's mind. Like even if there wasn't one, people will go, well, there must have been a moon. What did the moon look like? So it's really funny how the way we ask questions can really influence people's answer. Whereas when if you just said, what was the night like, people will give a more.
That's one thing I have found with many different surveys is it's not what the question is, but it's how the question is asked. And it may be geared verbally in such a way that you are left with a restricted amount of answers that you can give, which may not be your true feelings on the matter.
Yeah, that's right, Tristan.
That's a really good point, Tristan. That's exactly right. Pointed, when things are pointed questions, or that, you know, that is a form of bias. Absolutely. And Rachel, I love what you said about who isn't asked, right? Sometimes the absence of things tells us as much as the presence, but we're not likely, unless we're thinking critically, to look at what's missing. We mostly focus on what's before us.
An interesting level of statistics actually from World War II regarding aircraft was what is called survivor bias. And they'd be looking at how to defend aircraft correctly from anti-air and other attack. And they were looking at what aircraft came back and where the impacts on those were. And those aren't what you should be looking at. You should be looking at, okay, where's the areas they actually weren't hit? And that's why they didn't go down. So the areas which the survivors came back with, which weren't hit, are the areas you actually want to armor up to save the aircraft that were taken down.
A very interesting example from history, no less. That's really cool.
I might just, Tristan, I see you've just asked a question. I might just answer this one and then stop the recording, but I wanted to answer it before I did, just because it's a good one. I think it was you, Tristan, it might be someone else, but about the PowerPoint in your speech for the oral presentation.
Oh, that was someone else, but
was it someone else? Sorry. I've forgotten who it was, but whoever it was, thank you for the question. Just so everyone knows, when you're submitting your Learning Portfolio B for your oral presentation, it does ask you to include a speech. So it doesn't have to be like a perfectly transcribed word for word speech, but, you know, just as long as we can see your plan, so we can see that structure, you know, your intro, your middle, your conclusion, and it can just be in written form. You don't necessarily have to include your PowerPoints unless you want to. And you can just pop it at the end of your LPB template or attach it as a separate Word document. So hopefully that clears that up for anyone wondering for LPB.
Just quickly, the way I have mine at the moment is just like S1 and then just notes on what I'm saying, and like S2 for like slide 2, and then what I'm having. Like that,
Yep, that's fine. Yep, as long as we can see it all structured out. Sorry, was it Tobias? It's the T's are getting me.
That's right.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Kimberly. I'll stop the recording here, but we will stay on if you have any other